Do you believe that your darkest moment can be the beginning of your most glorious victory? I'm 65 years old, and I thought I had done everything I possibly could for my son. But on his wedding day, what should have been the happiest day of his life, I was ridiculed by my own wealthy in-laws. They looked at me with pity in their eyes, as if I were a piece of a poor past that needed to be cast aside. I sat there, alone in the crowd with a shattered heart, listening as they turned my life's sacrifices into a joke. But then my son, the very child I had spent my entire life protecting, did something unexpected. Would he choose to stand with the mother who gave him life? Or would he choose the wealthy future that awaited him? The bitter toast. My name is Imani Williams. I am 65 years old. And this is the story of my son's most important day. The day I almost lost everything before he won it all back for me. The air in the ballroom was thick, heavy with the scent of lilies and money. It was the kind of air that feels difficult to breathe, the kind that sticks to your skin in the humid savannah heat. I sat at the head table, a small island in a sea of white linen and shimmering crystal. My son, my Marcus, was getting married, and from the moment I had walked in, I felt like a stranger at my own life's celebration. I smoothed down the silk of my sapphire dress, a nervous habit. My hands felt cold, even in the warmth of the room. Across the table, the bride's family, the Vances of Charleston, held court. They were a force of nature, loud and glittering. Their laughter echoed, sharp and bright, like ice cubes clinking in a tall glass of sweet tea. And then, Reginald Vance, the bride's father, stood up. He was a tall man, a retired federal judge, and he carried himself with the weight of a man who had never been told no in his life. He tapped his champagne flute with a manicured fingernail, a crisp, clean sound that cut through the chatter like a tiny, sharp blade. The room fell silent. Friends, family, he began, his voice smooth and deep, like aged whiskey. He spoke of legacy, of tradition, of the joining of two great Southern families. I watched my son, Marcus, who sat beside his new wife, Isabella. He looked handsome in his tuxedo. He looked happy. My heart ached with a pride so fierce it felt like a physical pain right below my ribs. Reginald's eyes, cool and assessing, found me across the table. His smile was perfectly polite, a politician's smile. It did not reach his eyes. And we must, of course, raise a glass to the mother of the groom, he said. The spotlight, it seemed, had found me. I could feel the heat of it on my face. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes turning my way. Some were curious. Some, I thought, were pitiful. To Imani Williams, he continued, his voice resonating through the microphone, filling every corner of the vast room. A woman of incredible resilience. A woman who has overcome so much from such humble beginnings to give her son the world. Humble beginnings. The words just hung there in the air. They were meant to sound like a compliment. I knew that. But they landed like a judgment. He was telling a story about me. A story of a poor, struggling widow who ran a little neighborhood bookstore. A story that was true. But not the whole truth. Not even close. In that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on me. Some curious, some pitiful, and I told myself, inhale, Imani, exhale, don't let him see you break. But the truth is, I was already broken. He wasn't finished. He raised his glass higher, the crystal catching the light. It takes a village to raise a child, they say. And when your village is a bit smaller than most, well, you must put in a truly extraordinary effort. We honor that effort today. Extraordinary effort. The phrase felt like a pat on the head, a condescending acknowledgement of my life's work. He made my struggle sound like a quaint little project, not the war I had fought every single day, every single hour. Since my David passed away, the silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning, the nervous rustle of silk as someone shifted in their seat. My son's face had hardened. The joy had vanished, replaced by a storm I knew all too well. He looked at me, his dark eyes asking a question I couldn't answer. Are you okay? Mama. So, I looked down at my hands, clasped tightly in my lap. My knuckles were white, the string of Akoya pearls around my neck. David's last gift to me suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Like a chain, Reginald's toast was met with scattered, polite applause. It died out quickly, like a fire with no air. The story he had told was simple. He, the powerful patriarch, was welcoming the son of a poor but hard-working woman into his grand world. He was the victor. I was the charity case. I kept my head held high. I even managed a small, tight smile that felt like it would crack my face. But inside, something had fractured. A piece of me. A piece I had carefully guarded for 30 years. Had just been shattered on the cold marble floor of that ballroom. Then, I saw it. The shift. Marcus pushed his chair back. Slowly. Deliberately. The sound of the wood scraping against the floor was loud in the quiet room. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at his new father-in-law. He looked only at me. And in his eyes, I saw not the happy groom. Not the respected university professor. I saw the little boy who once stood between me and a barking dog. Arms outstretched, promising to protect me from all the monsters in the world. He stood up. He walked to the microphone, and the entire room held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The reading nook and the dreams. Time is a funny thing. It can stretch out long and slow, like honey dripping from a spoon, or it can snap shut in an instant. As Marcus reached for the microphone, the years between that grand ballroom and a small, dusty storefront collapsed into nothing. And for a moment, I wasn't there at all. I was back. Back in the beginning. Our beginning was a place called the Reading Nook. It wasn't much back then. Just a little shop on a quiet, oak-lined street in Savannah, with peeling paint and windows that rattled when the wind blew. But to me and my David, it was a kingdom. He was a history teacher with a poet's soul. And I was a librarian who believed a good book could mend just about anything. We poured all our savings and all our dreams into that little store. David came up with the name. He said he wanted a place that felt like a hug, a corner of the world where anyone could come in, find a comfortable chair, and get lost for a while. A reading nook. We filled it with second-hand books, their pages soft and yellowed with age, smelling of paper and time and the ghosts of readers past. We served coffee that was probably too strong and homemade pound cake that was always a little lopsided. Marcus was born in the middle of all that, our beautiful boy. He grew up between the shelves, learning his ABCs from the spines of classic novels. He took his first steps on the worn Persian rug by the poetry section. The reading nook wasn't just our business. It was his nursery. It was our home. Those were the good years. The years when life felt simple, full of the scent of old books and fresh coffee and the sound of my husband's easy laughter. And then, just like that, the laughter stopped. It was a Tuesday. I remember that. A rainy Tuesday in April. David had been feeling tired for weeks. A cough he couldn't shake. The doctor said it was pneumonia, a bad case. But David was strong. He was a fighter. I never, not for 1 second, believed he wouldn't come home. He died 3 days later. A heart that had just worked too hard for too long. They said, the world didn't just stop. It shattered. The pieces of my life were scattered all around me, sharp and unrecognizable. For weeks, I just existed. I moved through the quiet rooms of our little house like a ghost. Marcus was only 10. He would come and sit with me, his small hand on my arm, not saying a word, just being there. His quiet strength was the only thing that kept me from floating away completely. One night, I sat by his bed, watching him sleep. His face, so much like his father's, was peaceful, and a promise took root in my heart. It was fierce and absolute. I leaned down and whispered it into the dark. I'll take care of you, Marcus. I promise the sleeping boy, I promise. You will never want for anything. And more than that, you will grow up to be a good man. A man your father would be proud of. That promise became my compass, my reason to get out of bed in the morning. A few months after David was gone, I was cleaning out his side of the closet, tucked away in an old shoebox. I found a small, black notebook. It wasn't a diary. It was filled with his neat, careful handwriting. But it was all numbers. charts, names I didn't recognize. Dow Jones, S&P 500. At the back, I found a list of stocks he had bought with the little bit of money his father had left him. That night, I sat in his favorite armchair, the worn leather cool against my skin, and I started to read. At first, I read it just to feel close to him, to trace the lines of his writing, to try and understand this secret part of his mind. But then, something strange happened. The numbers started to make sense, the patterns, the logic, the rhythm of the market. It wasn't just chaos, it was a language, and I realized, with a shock that ran through my whole body, that I could understand it. I started small. I used the money from his stocks, a few $1,000s, and I followed the rules I saw in his notebook. I read every book I could find at the library. I studied. I learned. During the day, I was Imani, the quiet owner of the reading Nook, selling worn copies of Faulkner and baking lopsided pound cakes. But at night, after Marcus was asleep, I would sit at our small kitchen table with the Wall Street Journal spread out before me, and I would become someone else. I was a strategist, a player in a game that no one in my world knew I was playing. It wasn't about getting rich, not at first. It was about that promise. It was about making sure Marcus could go to any college he wanted. It was about making sure that the lights in our little house would never, ever go out. It was about building a fortress around my son, brick by invisible brick. And as I stood there in that grand ballroom, watching my son take the microphone, I thought of that little black notebook. I thought of the promise I made in the dark. I had kept that promise. I had built a fortress. But I had never imagined that the greatest threat would not come from outside the walls. It would come from within. From a man in a $1,000 suit, holding a glass of champagne, who thought he could sum up my entire life in 2 words: humble beginnings. The Vance legacy. Marcus brought Isabella home to meet me about a year before the wedding. He was nervous. I could tell by the way he kept adjusting his collar, even though it was a perfectly comfortable Sunday afternoon. He loved this girl. It was written all over him, in the softening of his eyes and the gentle way he said her name. And then she walked into my little bookstore, the reading Nook, and I understood why. Isabella Vance was luminous, not just beautiful, though she certainly was that, with skin the color of warm honey and eyes that were a deep, intelligent brown. But she carried a light within her, a quiet confidence that wasn't loud or boastful. It just was. That evening, we drove to Charleston to have dinner with her family. I wore my best dress, the simple black one I saved for special occasions. I felt a flutter of anxiety in my stomach, the same kind I used to get before a big exam in college. I was a mother meeting the in-laws, but it felt like more than that. It felt like I was crossing into a different world. The Vance home wasn't just a house. It was a mansion, a grand, white-pillared testament to generations of wealth and influence, nestled behind a wrought iron gate in the most historic part of the city. Live oaks draped in Spanish moss stood like ancient sentinels on the lawn. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and old money. Everywhere I looked, there were portraits, stern-faced men and elegant women, all Vances, stared down from the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow me. Reginald, the judge, walked me through the hall, pointing them out. A great-grandfather who was a pioneering doctor, a great-aunt who was a celebrated poet. The story was clear. They didn't just have a family, they had a legacy. For a moment, a wave of self-consciousness washed over me. I thought of my own family portraits, a handful of faded, black and white photos in a worn leather album on my coffee table. My father, a mechanic with grease permanently under his fingernails. My mother, a seamstress with the kindest smile I'd ever known. Good people, hardworking people, but we didn't have a legacy. We just had life. Dinner was served on china so fine I was afraid to touch it. The conversation was a dance of polite, probing questions. Reginald spoke about his latest trip to Europe, his wife, Eleanor. She spoke about a charity gala she was organizing. They were impeccably polite, but underneath it all, I felt a current of assessment. They were measuring my son. They were measuring me. At one point, Reginald turned to me. His smile practiced. Marcus tells us you own a bookstore. Imani, how charming. It's quite admirable that you've kept such a romantic business alive in this digital age. Romantic. The word was meant to be a compliment, I suppose, but it felt dismissive, like my life's work. The business David and I had poured our souls into was a quaint little hobby, something to be admired from a distance, like a ship in a bottle, not something to be taken seriously. The first crack in the perfect facade. Later in the evening, I found a moment of quiet in the library. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, all bound in dark, serious leather. I was running my fingers over a collection of James Baldwin when Isabella came in. She didn't speak right away. She just stood there for a moment, watching me. Then she smiled. A genuine, warm smile that was so different from her father's. "He's one of my favorites," she said, nodding at the book in my hand. "Mine too," I replied, surprised. "I have a first edition of Go Tell It on the Mountain," she continued, her voice soft. "My great-aunt, the poet, gave it to me. She said Baldwin taught her that you could tell the truth with fire, but also with grace." We talked for a while, not about her family's legacy or my romantic business. We talked about books, about the way a story can change you, about the power of words. In that dark, intimidating library, I saw her, the real Isabella, not a Vance of Charleston, just a young woman who loved books. A young woman who understood that the most important legacies aren't always the ones hanging on a wall. I felt a seed of hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe my son had found someone who could see beyond the surface. Someone who understood the language of the heart. Not just the language of the bank account, but the doubt still lingered. She was a product of this world, this grand, imposing legacy, and I wondered which part of her would win out in the end. The woman who treasured a first edition, or the daughter of the man who saw my life as merely charming. That was the first time I met Isabella. And the first time I felt the invisible wall that Reginald Vance had built around his world. Have you ever felt like you were being judged by your cover before anyone even bothered to read a single page of your story? Share your experience in the comments below. I'd truly love to hear from you. The speech. My son stood before the microphone. He didn't tap it. He didn't clear his throat. He just stood there for a beat. A solid, silent presence. The room was so quiet I could hear the nervous beat of my own heart against my ribs. He looked out at the sea of faces. Then, he turned his head slightly and looked directly at Reginald Vance. "Thank you. Everyone," he began, his voice calm and steady. It was his professor's voice, the one he used to command a lecture hall of hundreds of students. "And thank you, Judge Vance, for your kind words about my mother." There was an edge to the word kind. It was subtle, but I heard it, and I knew, in that moment, that the little boy who protected me from barking dogs was gone. A man stood in his place. "You spoke of my mother's humble beginnings," Marcus continued, his voice never rising, but somehow filling the cavernous room. "And you spoke of her extraordinary effort. I'd like to talk about that, too." He paused. He took a slow breath. "My mother's village wasn't small, Judge. It was a universe. It was a universe contained within the four walls of a little bookstore called the Reading Nook. It wasn't built on a legacy of wealth or property. It was built on a foundation of integrity." His eyes swept the room, but I knew he was speaking to me. "She taught me that the value of a man isn't measured by the balance in his bank account. It's measured by the promises he keeps, by the honor he upholds. She taught me that you don't need a mansion to build a home. You just need love. And a whole lot of books." A soft ripple of laughter went through the room, nervous at first, then warmer. Reginald Vance's face was a mask of stone. Isabella, beside him, was watching her new husband with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was fascination. It was pride. Marcus's voice grew stronger, firmer. "My mother's effort wasn't just extraordinary. It was a daily act of defiance. It was the defiance of a woman who lost the love of her life and refused to let grief be the final chapter of her story. It was the defiance of a black woman in the South who decided to own her own business, to be her own boss, to write her own destiny." He looked straight at me now, and for the first time, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. "So, You are right. Judge, I come from a humble place. I come from a home where the greatest inheritance wasn't stocks or bonds, it was character. It was the simple, profound lesson that you stand up for what is right, even when your voice shakes. And then, he delivered the final, devastating blow. He spoke it not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. That is the only legacy I bring to this marriage, and it is the only foundation upon which I intend to build a life with your daughter. For a second, there was absolute silence, a stillness so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. Then, someone started to clap. An old friend of mine from the bookstore, I think. Then another person joined in, and another, and within seconds, the entire room, save for the Vance family table, was on its feet. The applause wasn't polite, it was a roar, a wave of sound and support that washed over me. Cleansing the sting of Reginald's words, I couldn't stop the tears now. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication. A quiet sob escaped my lips. My friend, Martha, who was sitting beside me, squeezed my hand. You raised a king, Imani, she whispered in my ear. Through the blur of my tears, I saw Marcus. He walked away from the microphone, ignoring the applause. He walked past his wife. He walked past his father-in-law. He walked directly to me. He reached me, his tall frame blocking out the rest of the world. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his strong arms around me and held me. And in that embrace, 30 years of struggle, of sacrifice, of silent, lonely battles, all melted away. I wasn't a charity case. I wasn't a quaint little project. I was the mother of the man who had just taught a room full of powerful people the true meaning of wealth. I was home. The first dance, after the applause finally softened, after Marcus had come back to the table to wrap me in a hug that said everything his speech had left out, the band began to play. A slow, gentle melody filled the room, washing away the last of the tension. It was time for the first dance. I watched from my seat as my son led his new wife to the center of the marble floor. The lights dimmed, and a single, soft spotlight found them. They moved together so easily, so naturally. Marcus's hand rested gently on the small of Isabella's back, and she looked up at him with an expression I couldn't quite read from a distance. They were their own small island now, a world of two in the middle of that grand room. All the noise, all the people, all the ugliness from moments before just faded away into the shadows. They were a beautiful couple. My son, tall and strong, his character shining brighter than any chandelier, and Isabella, graceful and elegant in her white dress, her head resting on his shoulder. In that moment, watching them sway to the music, a feeling of pure, uncomplicated happiness washed over me. The hurt from Reginald's words was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface. But it was quiet now. It couldn't touch the beauty of what I was seeing. It wasn't until a week later, over a cup of tea in my quiet little bookshop, that Isabella told me what happened on that dance floor. She had come to visit by herself. She brought me a small pot of orchids and a bag of the expensive coffee she knew I secretly liked. We sat in the two worn armchairs by the window, the afternoon sun streaming in, dust motes dancing in the light. It was peaceful. For a long time, we just talked about simple things. The wedding, their honeymoon plans. Then, she grew quiet. She looked down at her cup, tracing the rim with her finger. Imani, she said, her voice soft. There's something I want you to know. About the wedding, about what my father said. I just waited, letting her find her word. I knew he was going to do something like that, she confessed, finally looking up at me. Her eyes were clear and direct. Not the exact words, of course, but I knew he would find a way to remind everyone of his own importance. He can't help it. It's who he is. She took a sip of her tea. I was terrified all week, she continued. Not of what he would say about you. I know who you are. I was terrified of what Marcus wouldn't say. I was scared he would do what our family always does. Smile politely. Keep the peace. Avoid confrontation at all costs. I listened, my heart still. I was beginning to understand. Isabella leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She told me what she had said to Marcus as they danced. Her words, a secret shared only between them. Under the cover of the music. "I know what my father did," she had whispered, her cheek against his chest. "I am so sorry." Marcus. He had held her a little tighter. "It's not your fault, Izzy. It's mine. I should have stopped him sooner." "No," she had insisted, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. "It's not your fault. But what you did next, that was your choice." She told me she could feel his heart beating, strong and steady against her palm. I was holding my breath through his whole speech. "Marcus, I needed to know. I needed to know for sure that the man I married would never, ever stand by and let our family be disrespected. Not for money, not for status, not for anything." A small smile touched her lips as she recounted the memory to me, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Our family, Izzy, starts with us, and we will always protect our own." She paused, and in the quiet of my little bookstore, I felt a profound shift, like the tumblers of a lock finally clicking into place. "Thank you for being my hero," she had whispered to him then. As the song came to an end, as she finished her story, Isabella reached across the small table and placed her hand over mine. Her hand was warm and strong. "I wanted you to know that, Imani. I wanted you to know that your son didn't just defend his mother that night. He defined the kind of husband he was going to be, the kind of family we are going to build. Together." I looked at this young woman, this brilliant, beautiful lawyer, who was now my daughter-in-law. I had seen her poise, her intelligence, but I had mistaken her quiet nature for compliance. I had worried she would be swallowed by the Vance legacy, but I was wrong. She wasn't a Vance. She was her own woman, and she had been playing a much deeper game than I ever realized. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the scent of old paper and coffee, I realized I hadn't lost anything at that wedding. I had gained. I didn't just have a son anymore. I had a daughter who was strong and wise in her own quiet way, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my son was in the very best of hands. Cracks in the castle. The months that followed the wedding were quiet, a good kind of quiet, the kind that settles over a garden after a storm has passed. Marcus and Isabella began to build their life, not in the grand shadow of the Vance name in Charleston, but here, in the gentle rhythm of Savannah. One of the first things they did was buy a house, not the sprawling mansion in the historic district that Reginald had offered them as a wedding gift. They politely, but firmly, declined it. I remember the phone call from Isabella. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath. He called it an insult. "Imani," she had told me. "He said we were turning our backs on family, on our heritage." I had just listened, and, "What did you say?" "Dear," I told him we weren't turning our backs on family, she said, and I could almost hear her smiling. "We were just building our own front porch to sit on." Instead, they found a small, charming house on one of the side streets downtown, a shotgun house. They called them. It was a long, narrow little place with a bright blue door and a tiny courtyard out back, just big enough for a small garden and a bistro table. They bought it with their own savings and a mortgage from the bank, a mortgage that was theirs and theirs alone. I would go over on Sundays for dinner. The house was filled with the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. We'd sit in that little courtyard, surrounded by the terracotta pots of herbs that Isabella had started to grow. Marcus would grill chicken, and we'd talk for hours as the sun set, the sky turning a soft shade of peach. It was a simple life, an honest one, and I saw a happiness in my son's eyes that I hadn't seen even on his wedding day. It was the quiet, steady happiness of a man who is the king of his own small castle. The phone calls from Charleston became less frequent. At first, it was Mrs. Vance, calling Isabella every other day with suggestions. Suggestions for decorators, for country clubs, for charities to support, but Isabella was always polite, always firm. "That's a lovely idea, Mother. But Marcus and I have decided to..." The calls started to stretch out. Once a week, then every other. The grand castle of the Vance family, the one built on generations of pride and legacy, had always seemed impenetrable to me. But now, I started to see the cracks. From a distance, you can see things more clearly. You see how the weight of a name can become a burden, how the pressure to maintain an appearance can hollow out the foundation from the inside. One afternoon, an old friend of mine, a woman who worked in banking for 40 years, stopped by the reading Nook for coffee. We talked for a long time about our children, our health, the way the world was changing, and then, just as she was leaving, she mentioned something in passing. "You hear about the trouble Judge Vance is in?" she asked. Her voice low. I just looked at her, my expression calm. I hadn't heard anything. "Well," she said, leaning in a little closer. "Word on the street is that some of his investments went sour. Badly. He put a lot of money into a new shipping venture that went belly up. Lost a fortune, they say. He's been trying to keep it quiet." Of course. I just nodded slowly. I thanked her for the news, but I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't need to. I had been following that shipping venture for over a year. I had watched it rise on a tide of hype and speculation, and I had known, with the certainty of a sailor reading the sky, that the storm was coming. That evening, after I closed the shop, I didn't go straight home. I sat in my quiet, empty bookstore, surrounded by the silent wisdom of thousands of stories. I didn't feel happy about Reginald's misfortune. I didn't feel vindictive. I just felt a quiet sense of inevitability, like watching a tall, proud tree that has been slowly rotting from the inside finally begin to tremble in the wind. The Vances had built their castle on a foundation of pride, of appearance, of the belief that their name was a shield that could protect them from anything. But they had forgotten the simplest rule: a foundation built on air cannot hold. It was only a matter of time before the cracks would spread, and the whole thing would come crashing down. The midnight call. The nights are quiet in my part of Savannah. After the last of the tourists have gone and the jazz clubs have played their final notes, a deep stillness settles over the neighborhood. All you can hear is the hum of the cicadas and the occasional rustle of the oak leaves in the humid air. I was asleep, deeply asleep. The kind of peaceful, dreamless sleep that only comes after a long day of work and a quiet evening with a good book. And then the phone rang. The sound was a violation, a sharp, digital scream that sliced through the peaceful dark. My heart hammered against my ribs. A phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning never brings good news. My first thought was Marcus. Something has happened to my boy. I fumbled for the lamp, my hand shaking, and grabbed the phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up with Isabella's name. "Isabella," I said, my voice thick with sleep and fear. "Honey, what is it? Is Marcus all right?" "He's fine. Mama Imani, he's fine." Her voice was a choked whisper, thin and frayed with panic. I could hear her trying to hold back sobs. "He's sleeping." I didn't want to wake him. I didn't know who else to call. I sat up, fully awake now. The fear for my son receded, replaced by a different kind of dread. "Tell me what's wrong," I said, my voice steady. What followed was a torrent of words, a chaotic, desperate story of things I didn't fully understand. Investors pulling out, banks calling in loans, a lifetime of wealth, of legacy, vanishing like smoke. It seemed the grand castle of the Vance family, the one built on generations of pride and influence, was crumbling to dust overnight. Her father, the formidable Judge Reginald Vance, was on the verge of losing everything. "They're going to take the house," she whispered, and a heartbroken sob finally broke through. "They're going to take everything. He's been on the phone all night. I've never seen him like this. He looks broken." I listened. I didn't say anything. I just let her talk, letting the story pour out of her. I pictured Reginald in his leather-bound library, the portraits of his ancestors staring down at him, his perfect world collapsing around his ears. I felt a pang of something. It wasn't pity. It was a quiet, somber recognition of fate. Then, Isabella took a deep, shuddering breath. Her voice dropped even lower, as if she was ashamed to even ask the question. "Mama Imani," she started, her voice cracking. "I know this is a crazy thing to ask, a completely insane thing, but you know people here, in the arts, in the business community in Savannah. People respect you. Do you know anyone at all, who might be able to help my father, The question hung in the silence between Charleston and Savannah, an impossible question, a desperate plea from a daughter who loved her father. Despite all his flaws, she was asking me, the woman whose life he had dismissed as a charming, romantic business, to find a savior for his fallen empire. I was silent for a long time, so long that Isabella finally whispered, "Mama Imani, are you still there?" I looked out my bedroom window at the ancient oak tree in my yard. Its branches like strong, steady arms reaching for the moon. I had watched that tree stand through hurricanes. I had watched it endure long, brutal summers. Its strength was not in its leaves, but in its deep, unseen roots. "Yes, honey," I finally said. My voice was different now. The sleepiness was gone. The alarm was gone. It was calm. It was cold. It was the voice I used when I was making a decision that could not be unmade. "Let me see what I can do," I said, a gasp of relief on the other end of the line. "Oh, Mama Imani. Thank you." I cut her off gently. "Listen to me, Isabella. This is important. You tell your father. You tell Judge Vance that a representative will be in contact with him in the morning, before the banks open. Okay?" She whispered. "Okay? But you must make one thing very clear to him, Isabella," I continued, my voice measured, each word chosen with absolute precision. "This is not a rescue. This is a negotiation." I hung up the phone. The room fell back into silence. But the quiet was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of decisions to come. If you are still listening, if you have traveled this far with me, would you do me a kindness? Please leave the empathy in the comments below, just so I know I have friends walking with me on this journey. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part of this story, the part where all the secrets are finally brought into the light. The Legacy Ventures. After I hung up the phone with Isabella, I did not go back to sleep. The idea of rest was a distant country I had no visa for. Instead, I went to the small Fanes, dark wood desk in the corner of my living room, the one that overlooked the quiet, sleeping street where the old oaks stood like silent sentinels. I turned on a single lamp, a Tiffany I'd bought myself years ago. Its soft, amber light pooled on the wood, a small circle of clarity in the darkness, and I began to work. There is a part of my life, a very large part, that almost no one knows exists. Not my dearest friends, not even Marcus. Not fully. He knows I am comfortable, that his father and I were careful with our money. He thinks I made some smart, lucky investments over the years that allow me to run the reading nook without worry. He has no idea of the truth. He doesn't know the scale of it. The truth is that the reading nook is my heart. It is my sanctuary, but it is not my living. My living comes from a world that is a million miles away from the scent of old books, fresh coffee, and lopsided pound cake. It comes from a small, intensely private investment fund that I started over 25 years ago. It's registered under a very discreet name. It is called I.W. Legacy Ventures. The I.W. stands for Imani Williams. And the legacy, well, the legacy is everything David left behind. The inheritance David gave me was not money. We had very little of that. His legacy was a single, black, cloth-bound notebook and an unshakable belief in the power of quiet, patient knowledge. He was a history teacher, and he saw the world in long, sweeping patterns. He believed that human nature, greed, fear, pride was the one constant in the chaos of the world, and that if you could understand it, you could predict the tides. He taught me that if you are willing to be disciplined, to do the slow, boring work of reading the footnotes and the fine print, and to look deeper than anyone else, you can find profound value where others only see risk or ruin. So that is what I did. For 30 years, I have lived a life split in two. By day, I was Imani, the woman in the faded apron, dusting shelves, talking to neighbors, recommending poetry to the brokenhearted. But in the quiet hours of the night, long after the last light in the neighborhood had gone out, I was a student. My kitchen table became my university. I taught myself corporate finance, contract law, market analysis, I read every annual report, every shareholder letter, every footnote. I learned the language of numbers until it felt as natural to me as English. I never gambled. I never chased the next hot stock or the flashy new tech company. My strategy was slow, deliberate, and deeply patient. It was David's strategy. I looked for companies that were like beautiful, historic houses on the best streets, but had been allowed to fall into disrepair. Houses with strong bones, good products, a loyal customer base, a solid history, but were suffering from poor, arrogant, or lazy management. I would begin by buying a small piece of them, a few shares, just enough to get the annual reports sent to a P.O. box I kept. I would watch them, sometimes for years, and I would wait. I would wait for the moment of greatest fear. The moment when a bad earnings report or a failed project would cause everyone else to run for the exits. And that's when I would step in. Reginald Vance's company, Vance Holdings, was one of those houses. One of the grandest I had ever seen. I had been watching it for nearly a decade. Not out of malice. Not at first. I watched it purely as a case study. A perfect, textbook example of a business built on the shaky foundation of a proud name rather than a smart plan. Reginald had inherited a solid, respectable manufacturing company from his father. It was the kind of business that, if managed with care, would have provided for his family for generations. But Reginald was not a builder. He was a caretaker, and a lazy, prideful one at that. He treated the company like his personal bank account, making risky, speculative bets, with its capital to fund his lavish lifestyle and impress his friends at the country club. He chased glamorous projects, like that ill-fated shipping venture, ignoring the slow, steady decay in his core business. His equipment was outdated, his best employees were leaving, the world was changing, and he was standing still, admiring his own reflection in the past. He thought his name was a shield made of steel. He thought the Vance legacy was too big to fail. He was wrong. So, when the first cracks started to show in that grand facade, I was ready. Through my fund, through Legacy Ventures, I began to buy up his company's debt. It was incredibly cheap. The banks were getting nervous. They saw a sinking ship and were desperate to offload the weight. I saw a beautiful old vessel with a foolish, drunk captain at the helm. I bought the debt from one bank in New York, then another in Atlanta, quietly. Through a series of anonymous brokers and shell corporations, my name was nowhere near any of it. To the outside world, it just looked like various financial groups were shuffling paper around in the ordinary course of business. Then, when the shipping venture finally collapsed and the panic started in earnest, I began to buy the stock. It was plummeting. The financial news channels were calling it a disaster. Everyone was selling. I was buying. Every share they sold in fear. I bought with quiet, calculated confidence. It was never a secret. It was all there, buried in pages of public filing, for anyone who cared to look, but no one was looking at the quiet, unassuming fund called I.W. Legacy Ventures, and they certainly weren't looking at the widow who ran a little bookstore down in Savannah, Georgia. Reginald Vance was so busy looking up at the sky, at the powerful men in Washington and on Wall Street, he considered his peers, that he never thought to look down at the ground beneath his feet. He never thought to wonder who, exactly, owned it. So, when I told Isabella that I would see what I could do, it was the truth. It was just a much simpler version of the truth. The truth was that I didn't need to make any calls. I didn't need to ask for any favors, because that morning, when Reginald Vance would get the official notice from the lawyers, when the last pillar of his proud world would come crashing down around him, he would find out that his biggest creditor, his largest shareholder, and the new, silent owner of his family's legacy, was me. The reckoning. The offices of I.W. Legacy Ventures were on the top floor of a sleek, modern building downtown, not the kind of place I usually spent my time. It was a world of polished chrome, dark wood, and hushed, important-sounding conversations. My lawyer, a sharp young woman named Ms. Anya Sharma, had arranged everything. I was sitting in the head chair of a long, imposing conference table when the door opened. Reginald Vance walked in, He was a different man from the one I had seen at the wedding. The arrogance was gone. The confident stride had been replaced by a hesitant, weary shuffle. His expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, as if he had shrunk inside it. He clutched a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. His eyes were tired, defeated. He was a man preparing to beg for the scraps of his own life. He looked at Ms. Sharma, who stood politely by the door. "I'm here to meet with the head of the fund," he said, his voice raspy. Ms. Sharma simply nodded toward the head of the table. Toward me. Reginald's eyes followed her gesture. And then they found me. For a full 10 seconds, he did not move. He did not blink. His brain, it seemed, could not process what his eyes were seeing. The polite, quiet widow from the little bookstore, sitting in the seat of judgment, a place he had occupied his entire life. The color drained from his face. The briefcase slipped from his numb fingers and landed on the plush carpet with a soft, dull thud. "You," he stammered. The single word a breath of disbelief. How is this possible?" I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at him. My hands folded calmly on the polished surface of the table. "Please, have a seat, Judge," I said. My voice was even, quiet. He stumbled into the chair across from me, the one reserved for visitors, for petitioners. He looked lost. A king suddenly finding himself a peasant in his own surrendered kingdom. "You were right about something, Judge," I began, my voice as calm as the still water of a deep lake. "You said it takes a village to raise a child. You were absolutely right, but you forgot one thing." I leaned forward just an inch. "Sometimes, the smallest villages have the strongest economies." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The formidable mind that had judged thousands of men and women was now completely blank. He had no words, no arguments, no legacy to stand on. "Let's talk about Vance Holdings," I said, my tone shifting. It became the voice I used in my other life, the voice of an investor, cool, factual, unemotional. I laid it all out for him. The bad investments, the leveraged risks, the refusal to adapt to a changing market. I spoke of his company not with anger, but with the detached precision of a doctor diagnosing an illness of pride, an illness of complacency. He listened, his head bowed, like a schoolboy being reprimanded by the principal. When I was finished, a long silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic far below. "So, what now?" he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're going to destroy it all, just to prove a point." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who was about to lose the only thing that had ever defined him. And in that moment, I felt not triumph, but a deep, profound sadness for him. "No, Reginald," I said, using his first name for the very first time. "I am not going to destroy it, because of Isabella, because of Marcus, and because of the grandchildren they may one day have. This company is now a part of their legacy, my legacy." He looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "But it will not continue on as it has," I stated, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "It will be restructured. It will be run based on merit, not on name. It will be managed with wisdom, not with arrogance." I paused, letting the weight of my next words sink in. "Marcus and Isabella will be given seats on the new board of directors. They will learn how to be custodians of their own future." I held his gaze. "And you, Reginald, you will retire." The word hung in the air between us. Retire. It was a death sentence to a man like him. It was an erasure. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, to summon some remnant of the powerful judge he once was. But he saw the look in my eyes. He saw that this was not a negotiation. It was a verdict, and it was final. He slumped back in his chair. The fight went out of him completely. All the pride, all the bluster, all the generations of legacy, just evaporated, leaving behind only a tired, old man in an expensive suit. He said nothing. He just sat there, staring at the polished table, defeated. And in the quiet of that room, high above the city, I felt no joy in my victory, only the solemn, heavy weight of a necessary justice. Finally served. Lessons from the Oaks. It's evening now. I'm sitting in my worn wicker chair on the back porch, here in Savannah, with a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. The day's heat is finally surrendering to a soft, forgiving breeze that smells of jasmine and damp earth. The sun has dipped below the horizon, leaving behind tender streaks of soft pink and bruised lavender across the sky. A final, gentle sigh before nightfall. The cicadas have started their nightly chorus, a sound so constant, so woven into the fabric of a southern evening, that it becomes a kind of silence. It's the soundtrack to my thoughts. Before me, the ancient live oak that anchors my garden stands dark and solid against the fading light. Its branches, heavy with the wisdom of 100 years and draped in Spanish moss, look like the wise, weary arms of an old woman reaching out to bless the world. I've known this tree my entire life. It was here long before me, and it will be here long after I am gone. It has taught me much about patience, about strength. Everything is over now, in a way. The great storm has passed. The company, Vance Holdings, has been restructured. It has a new name now, a new board. Reginald is retired, living quietly in that grand house in Charleston. He is. I hear from Isabella, a much quieter man. The booming voice has softened, the arrogant stride has slowed. Perhaps, in the quiet of his forced retirement, he is finally reading the books in that leather-bound library of his. Isabella tells me he spends a lot of time with his grandchildren now. My grandchildren, telling them stories not of a great legacy, but simply of his own childhood. Perhaps he is discovering that the most valuable stories are often the smallest ones. Marcus and Isabella are learning the ropes of the business. I watch them, not with the anxious eyes of a mother, but with the calm confidence of an investor. They are not heirs inheriting an empire. They are students of a legacy, their own, which they are now building together. Day by day, they are learning the difference between the appearance of wealth and the substance of it. They are building something new, something stronger and more honest. On the foundations of the old, I often think about that day in the conference room, high above the city. I held all the cards, all the power. I could have crushed him. I could have savored a cold, satisfying revenge for the years of quiet condescension, for that one public humiliation that had cracked my soul open. But as I sat there, looking at the shell of a man across the table, I didn't feel vengeful. I only felt a deep, profound sadness. Revenge is a fire. It feels warm for a moment, but it burns the person who holds it just as surely as it burns the one it is thrown at. Justice, true justice, is about restoring balance. It's about tending the garden, pruning the dead branches, not salting the earth so nothing can ever grow again. I look at my old oak tree, its roots running so deep they are a part of the very foundation of this house. And I think about what it means to be a parent. For so long, for so many years, I thought my job was to protect Marcus from the world, to be his shield against the wind, his roof against the rain. But raising a child, I've learned, is a lot like tending an oak. You can't shield it from the storms. If you did, its roots would never learn to grow deep. They would stay shallow, weak, unprepared for the inevitable hurricane. You have to let the wind blow. You have to let the rain fall. You must trust that the foundation you helped build, the quiet lessons taught over shared meals and bedtime stories, is strong enough to hold. The greatest legacy we can leave our children is not the shade we provide for them, but the strength of their own roots to stand firm long after we are gone. A few weeks after that final meeting, Marcus came over. He didn't call first. He just appeared at the back door, the way he used to when he was a boy. We sat right here, on this porch, in these same chairs, as the sun went down. He was quiet for a long time, just watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. Then he said, his voice low, "That speech, Mama, it was the most terrifying thing I've ever done." I reached out and took his hand. It was a big, strong hand now, calloused from his work in his own small garden. But I could still feel the phantom grip of the little boy who used to cling to my fingers when we crossed the street, and I asked gently. He turned to look at me, his eyes clear and steady in the twilight, and it was the proudest moment of my life. I smiled. a real smile that reached my eyes and warmed my whole face. I told you then. And I'll tell you now. My son, true loyalty, true love, isn't about blind obedience. It's not about never disagreeing. It's about having the courage to defend the values your parents taught you, especially when it's hard. It's about standing up to the world, if you have to protect what is right and what is true. That day, at that wedding, you became your own man. We live in a loud world, a world of noise and flash, where worth is so often measured by what can be seen: the big house, the fancy car, the important title on a business card. We are taught to admire the sprawling branches, the impressive canopy, the outward signs of success. But my life, my quiet, ordinary life, has taught me that true strength, the kind that endures, is almost always invisible. It's in the roots, buried deep in the dark, quiet earth, working tirelessly where no one can see. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need recognition. It simply does its work, holding the tree steady through every drought, every flood, every storm that comes. And sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make in a noisy world is a quiet, unshakable silence. The last of the light has faded now. The sky is a deep, velvety blue, dotted with the first shy stars. The fireflies are out in full force, little sparks of magic in the deep green of the garden. My little bookstore is doing well. My son is happy. My daughter-in-law is a gift I never expected. The world keeps turning, with all its noise and its fury, its grand pronouncements and its empty promises. But here, in my small corner of it, there is peace. A peace that was hard won. A peace that is deep and true. My name is Imani Williams. I am 65 years old. And finally, after all of it, I have found my peace. Right here, under the shade of the legacy I planted myself. The story of Imani Williams and the wedding that changed everything ends here. What did you think of Imani's final decision? Would you have done anything differently in her place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly read every single one. If this story made you think or made you feel, please don't forget to leave a like. Share it with someone you believe it will touch. And subscribe to Deepu Cater Stories so you don't miss the next chapter we uncover. I'll see you in the next story, and who knows? Maybe next time, it will be your story we tell.